Tonight's presentation is titled, What is Preventive Maintenance? Our presenter is Mike Busch. Mike is president of Savvy Aviation Incorporated, author for numerous aviation publications over many years, holds a certified flight instructor certificate, an A&P mechanic certificate with inspection authorization privileges, Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year in 2008, and a member of EAA, continuing in a series of monthly webinars. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Mike. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Good evening, Tim, and good evening, everybody. We've got a really nice turnout tonight. Looks like there's over 600 people in the room, and I hope a lot of you are owners of certificated aircraft that like to swing wrenches on them, because if you are, the subject of tonight's presentation should be of particular interest to you. We want to talk about preventive maintenance. Let me start by talking about a little bit of regulation. FAR 43.3 is the rule that defines who may perform maintenance on a certificated aircraft. And it lists the kind of the usual list of suspects. Mechanics, certified mechanics are allowed to work on aircraft. FAA Part 145 repair stations are allowed to work on aircraft. And people who hold a repairman certificate that are employed by repair stations are allowed to work on aircraft. Similarly, air carriers and the repairmen they employ, and under certain circumstances, manufacturers are allowed to perform certain maintenance on certificated aircraft. Now, in addition to all of that, the rule permits anybody, even non-certificated people, to perform maintenance on certificated aircraft, provided that it's done under the supervision of a certificated mechanic, and their work is approved by that mechanic. If the rule didn't say that, nobody would ever be able to accumulate the experience necessary to get a mechanic's rating. So this is the part of the rule that allows people to basically to become apprentice mechanics and to accumulate the time required to apply for their mechanic certificate. And it's also the part of the rule that allows aircraft owners who want to do things like owner-assisted annuals and so on to do that. Basically, anybody can work on a certificated aircraft if an A&P is willing to supervise and sign off the work. Now, beyond all that, the rule, and this really gets to the heart of what we're going to be talking about tonight, it permits a pilot to perform preventive maintenance on an aircraft owned or operated by that pilot, provided the aircraft is used non-commercially under Part 91. And the pilot can perform preventive maintenance on the aircraft on his own recognizance without getting an A&P involved, which is pretty cool. So the question that we're going to address tonight is, what exactly is this preventive maintenance stuff that pilots who are not certificated mechanics are allowed to do on their aircraft on their own authority without having to be supervised by a mechanic? Now, you'd think the answer to that would be simple, but it turns out it's not simple, and it turns out that it is something that is not well understood. So I want to bring a little clarity to it. Let me start with the definition of preventive maintenance. FAR 1.1 is where all the definitions appear in the FARs. And there is a definition of preventive maintenance in FAR 1.1. And here's what it says. It says preventive maintenance means simple or minor preservation operations and the replacement of small standard parts not involving complex assembly operations. Well, that's very nice, but it's almost impossible to figure out what that definition means. I mean, what is simple or minor? what are small standard parts, what are complex assembly operations. This definition is not particularly helpful in figuring out what kinds of things an owner pilot who is not a mechanic is allowed to do on the aircraft. So to help clarify that, the FAA put a list of preventive maintenance tasks in Appendix A of Part 43. Appendix A of Part 43 basically has 3 lists in it. There's a list of stuff that the FAA considers to be major alterations. There's another list of stuff that the FAA considers to be major repairs. And finally, there's a list of stuff that the FAA considers to be preventive maintenance tasks. And that's what's in Appendix A, are these 3 lists. Now, the first 2 of those lists, the lists of major alterations and the list of major repairs, are clearly understood to be just examples of what the FAA considers to be major alterations and major repairs, not an exhaustive list, because it's obviously impossible for the FAA rulemaking lawyers to make a list of every sort of alteration or repair that somebody might want to perform on an aircraft. So these 2 lists of major repairs and major alterations are clearly exemplary rather than exhaustive. They give examples of things that the FAA considers major, but they don't purport to be a list of everything that the FAA would consider major. When we get to the 3rd list, the one that talks about preventive maintenance, this one seems a little bit different. The 3rd list, Appendix A, List C, starts with the following language. It says, preventive maintenance is limited to the following work, provided it does not involve complex assembly operations. And following that introductory sentence, it gives a list of 31 specific enumerated tasks that the FAA considers to be preventive maintenance. Here are some of them. I didn't list all 31. But changing tires, servicing shock struts, greasing wheel bearings, lubricating pretty much anything on an airplane, changing the oil, servicing hydraulic fluid, repairing upholstery, replacing seats and belts, side windows, simple skin and fabric repairs, repairs to cowlings and fairings, changing landing light bulbs and position light bulbs, repairing landing light wiring, replacing spark plugs, cleaning and gapping spark plugs, replacing prefabricated fuel lines, replacing hose connections, cleaning strainers and filters, replacing and servicing batteries, removing and replacing tray-mounted avionics, except for pulse equipment, transponders and DMEs, but anything else, if it's tray-mounted avionics, pilots are allowed to slide it out of the panel, take it to an avionics shop, slide it back in, and that's considered to be a preventive maintenance operation. And there's more stuff. There's stuff that applies to balloons, and there's stuff that applies to helicopters and so on. There's 31 of them altogether. It's a pretty generous list. There's a lot of stuff on it. But when you study the list, it's a little strange. It's not clear exactly what the FAA was thinking when it came up with this list. Certain items on the list jump out at me as being things that really shouldn't be on the list because they don't come close to meeting the FAR 1.1 definition. For example, replacing side windows. If you're talking about replacing side windows on a Cessna or Bonanza or a Mooney or something, that's a really non-trivial job. It's a nasty job. It involves using 2-part catalytic sealant that requires small tactical nuclear weapons to remove. Even A&Ps hate changing windows. It's a messy job. So saying that's something that a pilot-rated owner can do, well, it's a little hard to understand why that's on the list. Some of the other items jump out at me as being things where you could really get hurt if you don't know what you're doing. Servicing shock struts with high pressure nitrogen, replacing tires on an aircraft, is hazardous unless you know what you're doing, and also requires a whole bunch of special equipment. You need jacks and bead breakers and a compressor and stuff. So there are some things on the list that just don't seem like they really belong on the list of stuff that non-mechanics ought to be able to do. Then there are other items on the list that are just head scratchers. I mean, for example, why is it okay to replace landing light and nav light bulbs, both of which are on the list, but not post lights or courtesy light bulbs? Why just those two kinds of bulbs? Why not bulbs in general? Or why is it okay to repair landing light wiring, but not other wiring? What makes landing light wiring more minor or simple or non-complex than other kinds of wiring? It's just very hard to understand how the list came out the way it was. When it comes to tray-mounted avionics, it also seems a little strange. Well, why can you remove a Garmin GNS 530W GPS navigator, but not remove a KT76A transponder? But that's what Appendix A says. It says you can remove tray-mounted avionics except for transponders and DMEs, and it's not clear why they would do that, why they would say that. And then there's some sort of strange things, and I'm going to mention this just because this is going to come back, and it's going to be very interesting. But why is it okay for a pilot to change the tires on an aircraft, which is sort of a complicated operation, but it doesn't say it's okay to check tire pressure? Why is it okay for a pilot to change the oil, but not to check the oil level? There are simple things that don't seem to be on the list, and complicated things that do seem to be on the list. So it seems a little strange. And are things like checking tire pressure or checking the oil level even considered maintenance? Where does the line of maintenance stop and the line of servicing begin? I mean, for example, we put fuel in our airplanes, and we don't make logbook entries and stuff every time we do that, because nobody considers that to be a maintenance task. But sometimes it's a little confusing as to exactly what is considered maintenance and what isn't considered maintenance. Then there's Advisory Circular 4312A, which is an advisory circular about preventive maintenance. And the advisory circular has the following wording in it. It says, Part 43, Appendix A, Paragraph C, which is what we just looked at, contains the list of those functions determined by the FAA to meet this definition. If a function does not appear in this list, it is not preventive maintenance. So if you read the regs, if you read the advisory circular, it seems pretty clear cut that the FAA is saying, if it's not one of these 31 items on the list, then you can't do it as a non-mechanic without getting an A&P to supervise you and sign off your work. That's what it would appear to say. But it turns out that that's really not the FAA's position, at least not as of about 10 years ago, when the FAA came out with a very interesting interpretation, which is known as the Khalil interpretation. In February 2009, the FAA Office of Chief Counsel Rulemaking Division, these are the rulemaking lawyers at FAA headquarters, AGC 200, they issued a letter of interpretation, an official FAA letter of interpretation, in response for a request by a gentleman by the name of David Khalil, who was Vice President and General Manager of Bombardier Learjet. And if you have a question about what the regulations mean, you can write a letter to the rulemaking division. I've done this a number of times. And after a few months, they typically will come back with a letter of interpretation. that is an official FAA position on what the rule means. So what Mr. Khalil did, general manager of Bombardier Learjet, is he wrote the FAA and posed the following question to them. And the question was, is it legal for the pilot of a transport category Learjet 60 to check the tire pressure? The FAA responded to Khalil's letter in 2009, and their answer, which I will go through with you, was a major game changer in terms of our understanding of what preventive maintenance actually is comprised of. Now, why would Khalil even ask this question? I mean, we check our tire pressure all the time, and nobody really thinks about it as being a maintenance operation. But the reason this question came up was because the Learjet 60 has very high pressure tires, up to 219 psi, and there's an airworthiness limitation on the Learjet 60 that requires the tire pressure be checked every day. So checking the tire pressure requires a special gauge, because normally normal tire pressure gauges don't go up to 219 psi, and special procedures, because that's pretty high pressure. And you could argue that checking the tire pressure on a Learjet 60 is a little bit risky because of the high pressures involved. So this is why Khalil posed the question to the FAA. And Khalil's question was basically, is this, checking the tire pressure on a Learjet 60, something a pilot may do, or does it require an A&P to do it? And again, this is something that has to be done every single day. There's an airworthiness limitation on this aircraft that requires the tire pressure to be checked every day. And the second part of the question is, does it matter whether the Learjet 60 is being operated under Part 135 as a commercial flight or under Part 91 as a non-commercial flight? So the FAA issued a response to this question. And surprisingly, the FAA's answer was that checking the tire pressure on a Learjet 60 is a preventive maintenance task, even though it's not on the list in Part 43, Appendix A. And as a result of classifying it as a preventive maintenance task, the FAA ruled that if it's a Part 91 non-commercial flight, a pilot is allowed to check the tire pressure. But if it's a Part 135 commercial flight, then it requires an A&P to perform the pressure check, because the FAR 43.3 allows pilots to do preventive maintenance only on aircraft that are being operated under Part 91 non-commercial. So at any rate, the FAA issued this 3-page letter of interpretation, and the really interesting paragraph is right in the middle of page 2. It looks like that. I know you can't read that, so I'm going to go through it with you because it's really quite interesting what the FAA said in this letter. So here is the relevant paragraph from the Khalil interpretation. Remember, this came out in 2009, 10 years ago. And the FAA lawyers are saying this: even though the introductory text of Appendix A, subparagraph C, states that preventive maintenance is limited to the following work, which we saw that quote, the lawyer said, in view of the broader definition of preventive maintenance in section 1.1, which is the definition, we believe that such limitation is not controlling. Similarly, for the same reason, we believe that the following sentence in Advisory Circular 4312A is overly restrictive. And the sentence was, if a task where maintenance function does not appear on the list, it is not preventive maintenance. So the FAA lawyers are saying the advisory circular is wrong. The wording in the introduction of Part 43 Appendix A paragraph C, the list of 31 items. That introductory language is wrong. And they go on to say, as with the other paragraphs of Appendix C, the ones on major repairs, major alterations, the lists of 31 items are better viewed as examples of the tasks in each category. They cannot be considered all exclusive, or as I was saying before, exhaustive. It's an exemplary list. It's a list of examples. It is not it's not an all-inclusive list, which is totally not what the understanding of almost everybody who's read the regulations was. But the FAA is saying preventive maintenance is not limited only to those 31 items. They go on to say, there are no doubt that many simpler minor preservation operations and tasks in brackets, and many replacements of small standard parts not involving complex assembly operations, this is stuff that's quoted out of the FAR 1.1 definition, are performed daily, especially on small general aviation aircraft, that the agency would consider to be preventive maintenance, even though they're not included in the listed items. So this is very interesting. The FAA's official answer, one that what became legal precedent 10 years ago, is that preventive maintenance is not limited to those 31 items on the list and can include all sorts of other tasks that are comparable in ease and non-complexity to things that are on the list. So if you want to change a burned out post lamp, just go ahead and do it. Never mind that it's not on the list. It doesn't have to be on the list. That's what the Khalil interpretation says. Since changing a post light lamp is no more difficult, complex, or risky than changing a landing light or nav light, both of those things are on the list, then what possible reason could the FAA have for not considering it to be preventive maintenance? Similar logic would apply if you wanted to repair, say, faulty nav light or strobe light wiring, which is not on the list, but repairing landing light wiring is on the list. And so how could one of these reasonably be considered preventive maintenance and the others not be? So, you get the idea. The FAA is saying that the 31 items are examples of what they would consider to be preventive maintenance. And if you want to do something that's not on the list, but that's similar to something that is on the list, no more difficult or complex or risky, you're on pretty firm legal ground, should your action ever be challenged, because the Khalil decision is the legal precedent that's been in effect since 2009. So contrary to conventional wisdom, which might have been valid before 2009, but no longer is, you are not limited to the 31 items on the list. So have at it, guys. And that's all I have, Tim, but I'd be happy to open things up for Q&A if I can.
Okay, Mike, the gray matter you just opened up, right? So we do have some questions.
You think I'm going to be hearing from somebody in the FAA about this?
Oh, I don't know about that, but gee whiz, I mean,
well, it's in black and white.
It's in black and white, yeah. So we get to use our own interpretation, and
it was actually it was written that letter of interpretation was written by my friend Skip Averman at AGC 200, who is a wonderful rulemaking lawyer in the FAA who always gets it right and always makes interpretations that are favorable to us. So he's one of my heroes.
So Mark is wondering if the limitations wording is wrong in the appendix and the advisory circular, why don't they change the wording?
Well, that's a great question, and I will give you my answer to why. It is very, very difficult and very, very expensive for the FAA to make rulemaking changes. It requires them jumping through a whole bunch of hoops, putting out a notice of proposed rulemaking and a comment period, responding to the comments, and so on. And as a result, it typically takes about 10 years for the FAA to make a rule change. There are few exceptions, but generally it's a very slow and expensive and cumbersome process. And so it's quite common for the FAA to effectively change the regulations through these letters of interpretation, which typically can get turned around in a few months, most of the time, as opposed to actually changing the rules, which normally takes years to do. And it may be that someday, when Part 43 gets some sort of an overhaul, this stuff will wind up being changed in the regulation. But that's basically the reason. It's very difficult and expensive and slow to change the regulation, and it's much quicker for the FAA rulemaking lawyers, who are the guys that write the regulations in the first place, to issue letters of interpretation that basically said, no, that's not really what we meant. And that's what happened in this case.
Graham says our local FSDO inspectors have often stated that about owner Part 91 preventive maintenance. Yes, you can do preventive maintenance, but you must have the appropriate service manuals, parts manuals, service bulletins, and tools on hand and comply with them. Your comment?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. When you're performing maintenance, when you're performing preventive maintenance, you are doing it under the authority of Part 43. Regulation 43.3 is what allows you to do it. And so when you're doing that, all of the Part 43 regulations apply to you. And in particular, the one that basically says you have to have the manuals is 43.13, which says that you have to use the methods, techniques, and practices is the language that's in there, prescribed by the manufacturer in the most current version of the maintenance manual or instructions for continued airworthiness. So if you're going to do maintenance, or if you're going to do preventive maintenance, then you're bound by 43.13, just like a mechanic would be. And it says that you have to use methods, techniques, and practices prescribed by the manufacturer in his maintenance manual, and it's pretty hard to do that if you don't have the maintenance manual.
Several people have asked this question. I'll use Richard's. Wow, how can I get a copy of the Khalil letter?
It's online. There's on the FAA.gov website. There's a place that you can search for all these letters of interpretation are published online. If you have a hard time finding it, you can drop me an email and I'll shoot you a copy, because I downloaded the PDF in order to make these slides. But all letters of interpretation are available online. There's a big database on FAA.gov. And if you do a search for Khalil, it'll probably come right up. Not sure if you Google Khalil interpretation whether it'll come up or not. Probably not. You probably have to go to the FAA.gov site where the letter of interpretation search page is there.
So Mark is wondering about, how does a pilot, after they've done the preventive maintenance, document it in the aircraft logbook? Do you sign with your private pilot certificate number?
That's exactly what you do. Again, if you're doing preventive maintenance, you're bound by everything in Part 43, and in particular, 43.9 says what's required in a logbook entry, and the logbook entry requires a date of completion, a description of the work performed, and an approval signature with a certificate number. And in the case of a pilot who's doing preventive maintenance under his 43.3 authority, he would make a logbook entry and sign it and put his pilot certificate number.
Several people are wondering about experimental aircraft, and does this apply and have the same limitations for preventive maintenance on experimental aircraft?
No, the experiment, Tim, you can probably be more authoritative than I can on that subject, but experimental aircraft are specifically exempted from the provisions of Part 43. So these rules really don't bind you if you're doing maintenance on experimental aircraft. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, just I guess owner operators are allowed to do all preventive maintenance repairs on experimental aircraft without any certification. The annual condition inspection required every 12 months does require the person doing that to hold either the repairman certificate for that aircraft or be an A&P mechanic. And the repairman certificate is something that the original builder of the experimental aircraft can obtain based upon their experience as the builder. And that's for the experimental amateur built category. So anybody can do maintenance repairs. There's the joke that the trunk monkey can do maintenance and repairs on the experimental aircraft because no certification is required.
Right, and on EABs, there really isn't a distinction between maintenance and preventive maintenance. You basically can do pretty much anything, correct?
Correct. George is wondering, are sport pilots authorized to do preventive maintenance on type certificated aircraft?
They are. The rule, I didn't actually call it out, but the rule says that the holder of a light sport pilot certificate is allowed to perform preventive maintenance on a light sport aircraft that sport pilot owns. But a light sport pilot can't do preventive maintenance on a Bonanza, for example.
James is wondering, does an owner or operator doing preventive maintenance have to be able to prove that they have been trained in the procedure they are conducting?
No, that's an interesting, very interesting wrinkle of the regulations. As an A&P mechanic, I am required to be supervised on any maintenance task that I have never done before. I am required to be supervised the first time I do it by another mechanic who has done the task before. But interestingly enough, that rule is not in Part 43. It's in Part 65, which has to do with the privileges and limitations of mechanics. And so it doesn't apply to non-mechanics who are doing preventive maintenance. It really should, and I think it's a flaw in the regulation. But technically, I'm required to be supervised the first time I do something I haven't done before as a mechanic. But as a pilot who is doing preventive maintenance, that requirement is not binding on you. It really, it seems to me that if anybody should be supervised the first time, it would be a non-mechanic, but that the regs are a little bit strange that way.
A few people wondering if you can go back to the slide that gives Khalil on it. They're wondering about the spelling when they do their Google search.
Khalil?
Yes.
Well, let's see.
And several people have said they've Googled it, FAA Khalil letter, and it came up right away, PDF link to the FAA website.
Well, that's the letter, but that's probably too small to see, right?
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
Coleal, it looks like.
How about that? Does that show up? I just hit the magnifying glass.
Yeah, David M. Khalil is the guy's name, Coleal, and it's the February 26th, 2009 letter.
Yeah.
Okay, Mark's wondering, hey, do maintenance manuals typically have instructions or methods for changing a light bulb?
That's interesting. Probably only if it's non-obvious. The basic rule is that you follow the maintenance manual, and if the maintenance manual doesn't tell you how to do something, then you go to a big giant advisory circular called AC 4313 1B, which is generally referred to as the Mechanic's Bible, but it's acceptable methods, techniques, and practices for doing repairs. And so it's kind of the standard practices book. So if you can't find it in the maintenance manual, you're supposed to go look at AC 4313 1B, which is about half the size of the Manhattan telephone directory. Yeah, it's also available online, but it's big. And hopefully you find the procedure that you want in one of those two places.
Ro wonders, have any of these letters of interpretation been rescinded at a later date? Do we need to check periodically to confirm they are still in effect?
I am aware of one or two very oddball cases where a letter of interpretation was I don't think it was actually rescinded, but it was superseded. There have been a couple letters of interpretations, one in particular that I got involved in that came out, and it was a very bad letter of interpretation, and I complained to the FAA, and about a year later they issued a supersedure that corrected the problem. That's very rare. Generally, these letters of interpretation remain in effect indefinitely. There is a procedure for rescinding them, but it's extremely rare. And I mean, I can't imagine the Khalil one being rescinded.
Shelby's wondering, what is the FAA's definition of supervision?
That's pretty interesting. The FAA doesn't really define it. The language in the regulation, I wish I had it in front of me, but it basically says the mechanic, if work is being done by a non-certificated individual, then the supervising mechanic needs to supervise the work to the extent necessary to ensure that it is being done properly. That gives the mechanic a total discretion as to how much or how little supervision is required. So if he trusts you and he knows what you know, he knows you know what you're doing, he can say, yeah, sure, go ahead and do that. Call me when you're done. If he doesn't trust you, or if it's a complex thing, he may want to breathe down your neck, but it's completely up to the mechanic. The other provision in the regulation says that the mechanic must be readily available in person for consultation, so that if the non-certificated person doing the work gets in trouble and wants to holler for help, that the mechanic is readily available in person. And there have been some questions that have not really been answered as to exactly what in person means, and whether a FaceTime call would be sufficient to meet the requirements of the reg. I don't think that that's a settled issue. The in-person requirement does seem a little bit archaic, given all of the knowledge projecting technologies that we have today. The fact that everybody's on the internet, everybody's got a high resolution graphic device on their hip, and a high resolution camera, and so on. And probably someday that question will be asked to the FAA and it'll be ruled on. But That's what the regulation says. But mechanics have a huge discretion as to how much or how little supervision to do. It's really the mechanic is signing off the work. He's on the hook if something goes wrong. So it's whatever makes the mechanic, the supervising mechanic, comfortable.
Scott's wondering, is it true that in order to perform a preventive maintenance item that you have to have the tools, knowledge, and ability to do the task to the same standard as the mechanic would do to the task?
Well, the question is phrased in a difficult way to answer. But the basic performance rule for anybody doing maintenance, whether it's a pilot, whether it's a mechanic, whether it's a repair station, is 4313. And 4313 talks about what procedures you have to follow. And that section of it is the thing that says that you basically have to follow the maintenance manual. And it also talks about the quality of the work that you have to do. And it basically says that when you do maintenance on an aircraft, the result must be as good as new with respect to a list of things that affect airworthiness. It doesn't have to be cosmetically as good as new, but in terms of structural strength, resistance to vibration and corrosion, and there's just a list of things that says to when you repair an aircraft, you have to restore it to as good as new with respect to that list of air things that are critical to airworthiness. And the language is in FAR 4313 rather. And anybody doing maintenance or preventive maintenance, that's the standard that is what defines the standard that has to be met.
James wonders, this issue is, of course, if work is done by a pilot and there is an accident investigated, what is the liability if the regulation is so vague?
Well, I don't think the regulation has anything to do with the liability. If a pilot works on an aircraft and screws it up, and his screw up causes an accident, he's going to be a defendant in the lawsuit. It really doesn't have anything to do with the regulation. It really doesn't matter whether he was authorized to do what he did or not authorized to do what he did. If what he did it causes a crash and somebody gets hurt, he's going to be held liable for it.
Roger wonders, would painting an airplane be considered preventive maintenance?
Actually, painting is on the list. There are certain things about painting that are not on the list. For example, if you paint the flight controls of an aircraft, then those flight controls have to be rebalanced. And the painting is a preventive maintenance task, but the rebalancing is not. And I'm sure the FAA would not consider the balancing flight controls to be a preventive maintenance task. But yeah, if you want to go paint your Cessna 150 with 50 cans of Krylon from Home Depot, that's legal. But either you have to not paint the flight controls, or if you paint them, you're going to have to get a mechanic to rebalance them after you paint them.
Would something like that require weight and balance then afterwards?
Normally not. Normally painting is considered to be a negligible change as far as weight and balance, but the balancing of the flight controls is typically fairly critical with respect to flutter and so on, and so it's necessary.
Wayne wonders, if the mechanic is supervising the work, who signs it off?
The mechanic signs it off. Technically, although it's very seldom done this way, but technically what the regulation, which is 43.9 is the regulation about logbook entries. And what it says is that the logbook entry is to be made by the person doing the work. And then it is to be signed by the person approving the work. Now, if a mechanic's working in your airplane, those two people are the same person. But if you're doing supervised maintenance, in theory, you as the person performing the work is supposed to make the logbook entry, because the logbook entry is basically a dated description of the work performed, and who knows better what the work performed was than the person who does it. So the reg says that the person who does the work makes the logbook entry, and the person who approves the work signs it off. Again, it's not often done that way, but technically that's the way it's supposed to be done according to the reg. And back, when I was, before I was an A&P and I did a lot of work on my airplane under supervision, I would always make the logbook entries and then present it to my supervising mechanic to be signed off. But frequently it's not done that way, but that's the way it's supposed to be done.
Eric wonders, are you aware of any further, more specific allowed or disallowed preventive maintenance tasks as judged by subsequent FAA enforcement actions, letters of interpretation? For example, is there any specific guidance allowing, disallowing changing brake pads, adding brake fluid, sinking the mags?
Well, the answer to the question is that I'm not aware of any specific interpretations in that regard, and frankly, as an advocate for aircraft owners who would like to be able to see them do as much work as possible, I'm pretty delighted with the Khalil interpretation, and I would not be tempted to ask any more questions of the FAA legal and have them define it any more tightly, because Khalil leaves things very loose, it seems to me, and from the standpoint of an aircraft owner, that's the way we would like it to be. We would like to have discretion, and the fact that the FAA is saying in its 2009 interpretation that there are lots of things that aren't on the list that are done every day and that the FAA wouldn't have a problem with. I kind of like just leaving it just like that.
Right on. Peter wonders, can an owner sign off an AD if the operations to be performed can be considered preventive? Example, greasing uplock rollers on a Bonanza Debonair. This is an AD.
The answer to that is that it requires a mechanic to sign off an AD unless the AD explicitly says that a pilot may sign it off. And there are a few ADs I know of that do have that language in it that allow a pilot to sign it off, but most don't. And so the answer is that even if you can argue that all of the compliance tasks qualify as preventive maintenance, the actual signing off of the AD is not something that a non-mechanic is allowed to do unless the AD explicitly has language saying that a non-mechanic, that a pilot may do it.
Brian is asking if you could please put up slide 33 again.
What was slide 33?
I don't know. Brian would like to.
Wait a minute. I can find. Here's slide 33. Is that the one he wants?
Well, that's number 33. I assume that's what Brian was asking for. Maybe he wants to take a screenshot of it. So few people have asked this question. What about the old aircraft like a Taylorcraft, a 46 Taylorcraft that doesn't have a maintenance manual? When it comes to doing preventive maintenance, what should they follow?
Well, I mean, what the regulation says is that you have to follow the methods, techniques, and practices prescribed by the manufacturer, or alternative methods, techniques, and practices acceptable to the FAA. 4313, Advisory Circular 4313-1A, that big thick thing, is a big book of method, techniques, and practices acceptable to the FAA. And if you use that, and the cover page of AC 4313-1B says, don't use the stuff in here if the manufacturer tells you how to do something. In other words, it says that the manufacturer's instructions take precedence over AC 4313-1B. So you only use AC 4313-1B to do stuff where the manufacturer hasn't told you. So in the case of an airplane doesn't have a maintenance manual, and presumably AC 4313-1B is what you've got. There are a few other advisory circulars that give acceptable methods, techniques, and practices in specialized areas. There's an advisory circular about seat belts and stuff, but the majority of the stuff that the FAA considers to be acceptable is in that one big giant service bulletin, AC 4313-1B, the Mechanic's Bible.
And Andrew is wondering, hey, how about slide 34? Can I see that one?
Well, if we're on 33 now, this one must be 34.
Yeah. I think that'll help Andrew there. Abel is wondering.
And I think 35 is one of the best ones, so I'm going to go to that one too.
Well, that sounds good.
It says the list is exemplary and not all-inclusive. And then if everybody got a screenshot of that, then 36 is kind of the frosting on the cake that said there's lots of things that aren't on the list that are performed daily that the agency would consider to be preventive maintenance, though they're not on the list.
Awesome, thank you. Abel's question, to make the preventive maintenance log entry under FAR 43, must you be rated as a pilot on that aircraft?
No, you have to be a pilot and you have to own the aircraft. Now, it would be a little unusual for you to own the airplane and not be rated on it, but it doesn't talk about whether you're rated on it. It just says you have to be a pilot and you have to be the owner.
So Timothy's got a question here. So what about inspections, question mark? We are all told to check our ELT every 12 months. I was surprised how many different answers I got regarding how to comply with this basic requirement. The FAR section says check battery, mounting, signaled strength. I talked to my A&P avionics shop, the manufacturer, and got all kinds of answers ranging from follow the rule, follow the manual with ELT, or send to the avionics shop. Can I argue an inspection is less invasive than maintenance?
By definition, an inspection is never considered to be preventive maintenance. Now, it's really important to define the word inspection in the sentence that I just gave you. When I say inspection, I mean an inspection required by regulation. Anything else is just a look-see, and you're allowed to look at anything you want to, and that's not a regulatory event. But to do an inspection required by regulation, that is never considered preventive maintenance, and is never something that a non-mechanic is allowed to do. And what inspections are required by regulation? Well, annual inspections, 100-hour inspections. There are progressive inspections. Most of us don't do those. And there are special inspections that are mandated by airworthiness directors or some other FAA mandate. And the annual ELT inspection is one of those special inspections. So the annual ELT inspection does have to be performed by a mechanic or repair station.
David's wondering, where do you see the most pilot owner mistakes in preventive maintenance and or potentially airworthy issues? Do you have an example of a mistake we can learn from?
Well, good question. Some of the worst stuff that we see have to do with electrical stuff. Pilots are kind of famous for using non-aviation grade wire and non-aviation grade connectors, and stuff that they bought down at the automotive supply house and so on. And that's really a no-no. The aviation electrical stuff has much more restrictive standards. The wire has to be special wire that can withstand fire and so on, and the connectors need to be decent connectors and so on. So I think some of the worst stuff that I've seen has to do with electrical wiring. Other things that you often run into are with owner maintenance or tightening fasteners without using a torque wrench. And most of the time, if I'll call him a rookie mechanic, tightens something so that it feels right rather than using the torque wrench, usually it's like grossly over tightened, which turns out to be a bad thing. I actually am going to be doing in a couple months. I've got an upcoming webinar that talks about threaded fasteners and the importance of tightening them correctly and so on, where I'll be getting into a lot of detail about that. But we see a lot of over tightened things by owners, particularly things like oil filters, where it's almost impossible to get the filter off if it's tightened too tightly, and other cases where fasteners are tightened so tightly that it compromises the strength of the fastener. So those are a couple of things that come to mind.
Donald and Joe had some questions here about flying clubs. So what if you're in a flying club and you're operator of the aircraft and you're not an owner, you're just a member of a non-equity flying club? Are you allowed to do preventive maintenance?
I don't know that there's ever been a formal ruling about that, but I think it's generally accepted that members of a flying club are all treated as owner-operators of the aircraft. I suppose technically it depends on what sort of flying club it is, whether it's an equity type club or not. But I think generally speaking, the FAA is okay with members of a flying club doing preventive maintenance on the aircraft in the club.
Brian's wondered, is filing a prop a simple procedure?
That's a good question. I mean, it depends on what it is you're filing out. There is quite a bit of material on that in AC 43.13.1b as to exactly how you are supposed to file a prop and how much metal you're supposed to take off and how long the filing thing should be to ferret into the rest of the propeller and so on. Generally speaking, that's not usually considered preventive maintenance. It certainly isn't on the list, nor is there anything that feels like it on the list. So again, in view of the Khalil interpretation, I can't make any formal pronouncements as to what is and is not preventive maintenance. That's really what the Khalil decision says. It says there's no formal definition of exactly what it is. It's a little bit in the eye of the beholder, but somehow filing a propeller doesn't feel like something that should be preventive maintenance. On the other hand, there are a few items on the list that I highlighted earlier that don't feel like they ought to be there either. So
Fred's wondering, wait, if I change the landing light and enter it in the logbook and sign it, I assume it does not require further sign off. Did I hear that right?
Right. Now, if you change the landing light and you replace it with an LED replacement that's STC, that requires an IA to sign it off the first time you do it, because it's an STC. It's considered a major alteration. But if you're just replacing a landing light bulb, with the same kind of bulb, that's definitely preventive maintenance. That's something you can do, and you never have to get a mechanic involved. You just have to make a logbook entry.
Dale's wondering, do you think is installing a battery charging connector preventive maintenance?
No. Again, what you're talking about there is an alteration. I think I would argue it's a minor alteration, so it's probably something that a mechanic can do on just a logbook entry. But alterations are never considered to be preventive maintenance.
John's wondering, is there a list or depository of rulemakings or interpretations that would help us work in cooperation with our A&P mechanics?
Well, I'm not quite sure how the first part of the question, the answer is yes. There's a pretty complete database of letters of interpretation available on the FAA website. It's not organized all that well. If you that's the thing. If you happen to know that you're looking for Khalil, then you can go right to it. You can also do something like search the database for preventive maintenance. You'd probably get a whole lot of hits if you did that, and most of them wouldn't be interesting. But all of the letters of interpretation are in a database. But finding the interesting ones is not the easiest thing in the world. And this particular one is very interesting and is not very well known. And it really constitutes a pretty major change in what everybody thought the rules were.
Mark's question is, I changed both main landing gear tires on my Archer, and it seemed to involve some complex removal of parts to accomplish. What does the FAA really mean by complex processes when they are talking about preventive maintenance?
Well, that's the thing. Nobody knows. And the changing tires is explicitly on the list. Now, to change the tires on most airplanes, including your Archer, you have to disassemble the brakes in order to get the wheel off. Disassembling the brakes is not on the list, but since the list says that you can change the tires, it's generally accepted that disassembling the brakes is okay. Even though it's not on the list, it's sort of a subpart of something that is on the list. Then the next question is, well, if you have to disassemble the brakes, are you allowed to change the brake pads? And there used to be this sort of generally accepted piece of wisdom that wasn't written down anywhere that said if you have the kind of brake pads that just pop off, then you can change them. But if you have the kind that have to be riveted on, then that's not considered preventive maintenance. I think in view of the Khalil decision, which kind of relaxes the whole thing and says, it really doesn't have to be on the list. I personally wouldn't have any problem with a non-mechanic pilot who wanted to change the brake pads that involved riveting. But you're sort of getting into a gray area, and you might find a cranky FSDO inspector that does have a problem with it. So that's one of the problems with the Khalil decision is it does put more of a burden on pilots who want to swing wrenches on the airplane to sort of make up their mind what's preventive maintenance and what isn't, because it sort of takes away the cut and dry definition that we all thought was in effect.
Phil's wondering, should we be making a logbook entry for adding oil or hydraulic fluid?
I don't think so. I think things like that are considered to be non-maintenance items, servicing items, just like putting fuel in the airplane. Nobody makes a logbook entry when they put fuel in the airplane. They don't consider that a maintenance thing. It seems to me putting oil in is the same, and topping off hydraulic fluid is the same. It's servicing. It's not maintenance. It doesn't run. Now I can't. There's no place where that's defined that I know of. So this is just sort of more tradition, I guess you'd say, than it is something that's written down in black and white. But there is a line somewhere between maintenance and servicing. Maintenance requires logging and servicing doesn't. And I don't think anybody knows exactly where that line is.
And I think it got grayer tonight for the people listening, in a good way, though, in a good way.
Yeah.
As long as people tackling that maintenance tasks have
there's something to be said for gray areas in regulation. It just gives us a little bit more wiggle room.
Absolutely. Paul wonders, for non-commercial operations under Part 91, would that include a flight instructor instructing in his own aircraft?
Yeah, it would. That's a Part 91 operation. A flight instructor instructing his own aircraft is required to do 100-hour inspections, but he's still Part 91 operation, and he can still do preventive maintenance.
Clee's wondering about gliders. Do gliders have more leeway than as we routinely take the wings off, elevators, canopies, wingtips off?
Well, again, that I don't know where that's defined, but you're right. That sort of thing is done all the time when you trailer gliders around. You normally don't have to hire a mechanic to do that for you. The aircraft are designed to make it relatively easy to do that. So, again, some of this stuff is not really that well defined. There's a definition of maintenance in FAR 1.1, and it includes, and I don't have it in front of me, but it includes inspection, repair, overhaul, preservation, replacement of parts. Taking the wings off a glider doesn't sound like it falls into any of those categories to me. So I would say it's a non-maintenance item.
Paul's wondering, would remove and replace an EGT sensor be maintenance?
Yeah, it's simple replacement of parts. I would given how easy it is, I would make a reasonable argument that you could do that as a preventive maintenance item, even though it's not on the list. But again, what the Khalil decision really says is the list is not exhaustive, and you really need to go back to that fuzzy FAR 1.1 definition. And if it feels right under the FAR 1.1 definition, you're probably okay doing it. And, you know, the FAR 1.1 definition talks about replacement of small standard parts. And so I would think that replacing an EGT probe would fall into that definition. It would be okay.
Scott's wondering, out of an abundance of caution, when in doubt, log it. Can that be harmful or bad to do?
Well, I mean, you're always supposed to log stuff, but the one caution is if you do something that you know isn't legal, you probably shouldn't log it. I had an FAA inspector once said to me, you know, you really shouldn't be doing that, but if you do it, for God's sake, don't log it, because then I'm going to have a problem with you. But yeah, assuming that you're not doing something that you know to be in violation of the regulations, yeah, you're supposed to log everything. And again, the logbook entry is just a date, a description of the work performed, a signature, and a certificate number.
Dwayne's wondering, referencing landing lights, what's the difference between an ST seed replacement and a drop-in replacement?
An ST seed, STCs are issued for major alterations. And so if you're installing something pursuant to an STC, that's a major alteration. That means that it has to be inspected and approved by an IA, and a Form 337 with the IA signature on it needs to be sent to Oklahoma City, becomes part of the aircraft's permanent record. If you're installing a drop-in replacement, which is not an alteration, then that's just made with a simple logbook entry. And there's no 337 and there's no IA involved.
Eric's wondering, somebody told me that solder should never be used on an airplane. Is it okay to use soldering iron on electrical connectors such as dome light bulb sockets?
It is not good to use solder in airplanes, and we generally avoid using anything that's soldered. And the reason for that is everything in an airplane has to be able to withstand vibration, because airplanes tend to be fairly high vibration environments. And so all the wiring in airplanes is normally stranded wire, which makes it quite flexible and can withstand vibration. Almost all of the connections are crimp connections or that sort of thing, mostly crimp connections. When you solder a stranded wire, you turn it into a solid wire, and that portion of the wire that has solder in it becomes subject to fatigue fracture. And I spent about a year hunting down an intermittent problem in my autopilot that turned out to be a soldered joint that had fatigue fractured, and it was very hard to find. But that's the reason we try never to use solder in an airplane, because the soldered joints don't do well in vibration. They are subject to fatigue fracturing because they don't flex.
Paul says the owner's manual of a Piper J3 Cub talks about regularly checking the propeller bolts. Can I infer that I'm allowed to retorque my propeller bolts?
No, I don't think so. Again, I can't think of anything on the exemplary list that involves doing anything like that. And it does, again, because it's now such a gray area in view of Khalil, you sort of have to decide for yourself. But that doesn't feel to me like a preventive maintenance task. And I tend to be pretty generous in my feelings about that, because I learned about maintenance as a non-certified owner who swung wrenches on his airplane for many years before I became a mechanic. And I like to see owners swing wrenches, and so I'm pretty liberal about that. But checking the torque on prop bolts does not seem like something that I don't think it's something the FAA would really consider to be a preventive maintenance thing.
A few people have asked about the brake pad replacement, and Don's wondering, what if you take the brake pads off and take to a mechanic to have the mechanic rivet the new pads on for you?
Well, that's certainly fine. And again, I've always thought that distinction between riveted and non-riveted brake pads was silly. It doesn't, it's not, it's pretty hard to screw up riveting brake pads. It's not like a classic rivet where you're driving it with a rivet gun or anything. So I personally wouldn't have a problem with a non-mechanic owner changing brake pads that were riveted. That used to be kind of the conventional wisdom in the pre-Khalil days. I don't personally think that that it would be a problem if you did that without a mechanic being involved.
Coyle is wondering, could it be considered preventive maintenance to replace an incandescent bulb if there were a LED landing light or nav light that was a PMA replacement?
Yes, if it's a PMA direct replacement, it does not involve an STC, then it's simply a replacement of a part with another part that the FAA considers to be equivalent. So since it's a landing light, and that's definitely on the list, there's no question that a pilot rated owner could do that. However, if it's an STC'd replacement for the bulb, then that's considered a major alteration, and it requires the IA and the 337.
Richard says, commemorative Air Force operates under Part 91. Who can do preventive maintenance since CAF headquarters owns the squadron aircraft? Could local squadron staff do preventive maintenance without being an A&P?
I would think so. The reg says owner or operator, and the word operator means, in FAA speak, it means somebody that has operational control over the aircraft. So if CAF headquarters owns the aircraft, but the local the local squadron is the one with operational control over the aircraft, then the local squadron should have the right to do preventive maintenance because they're the operator.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic, Mike. Well, a few more questions out there still, but they're all kind of repetitive of what we've already talked about. So let's wrap it up here. Please take a moment and share closing thoughts with everybody.
Okie doke. Well, I'm glad to say we're in the home stretch of ownership volume 2. We're pushing really hard to have it ready by Christmas, and I think we're going to make it. It's going to be close, but that's the goal. The first 3 books, of course, are on Amazon now, and ownership volume 2 Should be ready by Christmas, and it's kind of going to be the last book I write for a while. I'm going to take a breather after that. If you're not, if you don't receive my monthly e-newsletter, you can go to savvyaviation.com website and put yourself on the list, or you can check the checkbox on the post-webinar survey that Tim's going to put up when I stop talking, and get on the list for my monthly newsletter. Comes out typically the third week of every month, and it has all sorts of maintenance kind of stuff in it. Upcoming next few webinars coming up in December, we're going to be talking about hangaring, and whether it's worth the cost to hangar an aircraft as opposed to tying it down. January 8th, we're going to be talking about breakdowns away from home. And as I mentioned earlier, in the February, we're going to be talking about threaded fasteners, bolted joints and tension, and probably after that I'm going to do another one on bolted joints and shear, which are the two kinds of bolted joints that we have on aircraft. So those are the next three webinars, and I guess that's it, Tim.
Oh, great lineup. Boy, that February 5th one looks really interesting. Can't wait for that.
You must be a geek.
Well, tension and shear, I mean, simple words, but they mean two very different things, and it's important stuff, so I can't wait to hear it. Hey, thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation. A lot of people with, great webinar. Thank you so much. Very informative. I know we had a great turnout. Must have had 770, I bet, tonight. So.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it was great. Everybody who tuned in tonight, thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Hey, thanks everybody. See you next month.